Now, a bombshell out of the International Monetary Fund today, spelling the end or the potential end of the age of American economic dominance. Now, according to the latest forecasts from the IMF, China is poised to overtake the U.S. economy in 2016, just 5 years from now, and much sooner than previously expected. Now, the rise of China and the relative decline of America is one of the biggest stories of our time. The implications are visible nearly everywhere, from shuttered factories in the Midwest to soaring costs of oil and other commodities. But if the end of America's economic hegemony is truly imminent, what are the implications for the globe and for free market capitalism? Well, with us to explain why we got here and what the future has in store is Max Frad-Wolf, economist at the New School. Max, thank you so much for being here. We all knew that this was coming, that China was on the rise, but I think that no one really had the sense that it was going to happen so quickly. I mean, if you look back just a decade ago, the U.S. economy was, I think, something like 3 times the size of China. How do we get to this point so fast?
Well, part of what happened is that the United States has been growing at struggling to grow at about 2 to 3%. And the Chinese have been turning in growth numbers of about 10 or 11% a year. We should also remember that China does have 1 billion more people approximately than the United States. So added up, their extra billion people should be producing an output at least as large as the U.S. And part of what we're seeing today, too, are numbers. The forecasts are at purchasing power parity, or PPP. And what that attempts to do is adjust the numbers for the differential cost of living. And China has a much lower cost of living than the United States. So sometimes to get an idea of how people are actually living, we look at something called GDP per capita, which says how much income does the average person get. And there the United States remains about 4 to 5 times higher than the Chinese numbers that we're likely to see in the next few years.
But is this significant? I mean, again, this is something that we knew that China was on the rise. We knew that China was poised to overtake the United States. What role, I guess, did our own policies play in making this kind of disparity?
Well, our own policies are largely behind the rise of China in many ways and the decline of the United States. I mean, it's probably not completely accidental that this comes a week, or it's sort of strangely fortuitous or eerie, this comes a week after we see Standard & Poor's threaten to put the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. sovereign debt, on a downgrade watch. And if you do keep importing more than you export, you keep running giant trade deficits, and you consume more than you produce, and you outsource and ship those jobs, and you import a lot of goods from another place, and that place is China, then you're actually sending out your growth, and they're receiving it. So if we've offshored a lot of our growth and brought in their products, that explains part of why we're growing slowly and they're growing relatively quickly.
So I guess any of the freak out that we might see from lawmakers on Capitol Hill should be taken with a grain of salt, given that our own policies were to blame. Now, broadly speaking, what in your mind does this say, the rise of China, say about the failures or successes of free market capitalism and democracy?
Well, I mean, I think there's maybe more to be debated about different rates of democracy between the United States and China. I think China is a pretty thoroughly capitalistic country, and we've seen its growth be very much driven in no small part by its competitive entry into particularly manufacturing for export. I do think that one thing the Chinese have done well and the Americans have done quite badly, which has accelerated this process, is the United States got to the sort of point where they made the assumption that American dominance was baked into the cake and we would be dominant because we're American, instead of thinking of it as an accident of history which is fragile and won't last. And the other thing is that we continue to make national and political policy for the political expedience and short-term benefit of a small number of politicians instead of having a really disciplined long-term outlook. And the Chinese continue to make basic policy decisions in order to maximize their growth and have a dominant position in the world economy 5, 10, and 20 years from now. And having much better policy eventually catches up with the people with the worst policy and benefits the people with better policy.
You know, it's interesting that you bring up this perspective that sort of the United States will remain at the top just because we're Americans. I think one of the thinkers that has, at least in the economic world, that has really contributed to that point of view is Francis Fukuyama, the economist, who actually happened to speak in Washington today. Of course, he's best known for his book, The End of History and the Last Man, where he predicted that liberal democracies will essentially become the final form of government. And one of our reporters was actually there and asked him whether he would take back his assessment, given the realistic economic realities of today. I want you to take a listen of what he had to say in response.
I don't think that the financial crisis is a fundamental defect of liberalism. It's a failure to regulate the financial sector adequately. And with sufficient political will, I think you could have avoided the crisis.
So in my mind, I mean, he's sort of blaming a few rogue individuals on Wall Street as opposed to the system itself, and sort of not willing to step back and look at the bigger flaws in his thinking in the system. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, I think that it always shows a certain amount of gravitas to be willing to admit a mistake, and shows quite the opposite when you're not. I think whenever you see predictions that whatever we're seeing right now will be forever or only grow, sometimes in financial markets this is called the permanently high plateau philosophy. You always know you're talking to someone who has a dim vision of the past and hasn't learned the lessons of history. Whenever we've been sure anything was here to stay, it's always perished fairly shortly thereafter. And that certainty, that sense of assuredness about what tomorrow holds, is a sign of hubris and not insight.
Well, and on that note, I mean, it's still mind-boggling to me personally that we continue to spend so much money on sort of trying to pay for our military dominance in the world, thinking that somehow military dominance will keep us in power regardless of the real economic situation. And you speak of this sort of short-sightedness and not willing to learn from history. Why haven't we been able to learn from, I don't know, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, and not understand that just because we spend a lot of money to be number one doesn't mean we're going to be number one if our economy doesn't support that?
Yeah, and I would ask, what are we spending the money to be number one in? What might matter more than whether or not you're number one. And the other thing is that people get into habits. It's hard when you've been successful at something to get off and figure out when it's not working for you, get off a particular path and figure out when it's not working for you anymore. And we haven't been particularly good on that front. The United States is still going to be very important, and the Chinese still have real fragilities, so we don't want to make the same mistake others have made in reverse. That being said, however, the United States has kind of spent like it could make its own rules, and for a while that worked, and eventually it doesn't. And the relationship between our spending and our revenue has to be gotten in line. And quite frankly, I'm not sure we can sustain anything like the society we've historically been unless we reinvest in jobs that pay people a living wage and make sure to rebuild the middle class that's barely hanging on to survival after the last 30, 35 years of policy and economic outcomes.
All right, Max, all good points, and I know there are lawmakers on the Hill who will have to buckle down and actually start paying attention to this when they come back from session next week. That was Max Fradwolf, economist for the New School.
Thank you.